Welcome to the Chasing Something podcast with me, Lorinda Pretorius. Here we get real and raw about the struggles and the joys of being a young adult following Jesus in a post-Christian world. Join me as I engage in tough, controversial, and highly relevant conversations to enable you to thrive in your chase. Before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to take a few seconds to tell you about the More Gathering by my favorite ministry, Moral Revolution. This gathering or conference is 2 days from the 17th to the 18th of July 2020. It will be online and it's specifically for Jesus-loving women. It's called the More Gathering because the motto is you are more than your past, you are more than your body, and you are more than enough. And they'll share incredible testimonies of people overcoming sexual trauma, body image issues, pornography addiction, and failures. I just really want to encourage you to buy a ticket to this gathering because it will be so life-giving and life-changing. There will be a link in the description where you can buy your ticket. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hi beautiful people, and welcome to today's episode. So today I have my friend Thornton. I can't pronounce his name because I don't know why, or I think I can't, but then he says it's kind of correct, so we'll let him pronounce his name for us. But we are going to talk about toxic masculinity and the role that all boys schools and just schools in general play in toxic masculinity. This is definitely a very needed conversation in South Africa, I think, especially now with gender-based violence getting more attention once again, and the really tragic state of South Africa when it comes to safety for women, which unfortunately, generally they're endangered not by other women but by men. And I think as Christians, we really need to care about this topic. We need to participate in conversations about it, and we need to look for holistic solutions to this problem. Just really bring the kingdom in this area, because it's a scary time to be a woman in South Africa. So, over to you. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. And why you're willing to have this conversation.
Thanks, Lauren. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Thornton Fincham, born in South Africa and raised in Krugersdorp in Gauteng, and then grew up in Pretoria. So the reason I love to have these type of conversations, and why I also love to have you on my show as well in the previous episodes, was just because it's these conversations are truly foundational towards getting a solution for things like toxic masculinity and all the other issues that you do discuss and we do discuss. I believe the basis for these type of things to get solved is good conversation and good structural conversation.
That's so true. Can you tell the audience just a little bit about your career? You're an educator, right?
Yes. So I finished my teaching degree in 2019, and I'm a teacher at a primary school in Centurion at the moment, and pursuing a master's degree as well, hopefully end of this year. And I also have a company called 3L, which is a strongly educational company with a bit of adventure linked to it as well. So yeah, my big heart is to see the educational sphere of South Africa and maybe even the world be transformed, and so that we have a bit more real life topics included, as well as kingdom topics, such as leadership, mentorship, just the basic inclusion of love. So even non-Christians can find a value to this type of education. But that's my passion. That's what I'm basically forming my career around, is trying to educate people around me, trying to live life to the fullest, and do it in such a way that I can communicate the kingdom, because I think the most difficult thing for our faith is to try and communicate it in such a world, in such a saturated world today. And I think I don't want to misquote someone, but a famous Christian author once said, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. So that's the type of life I really try to live. I don't always hit the mark, but I try to live that type of life. But most of the time I actually use words, and yeah.
No, I really appreciate it, and like you mentioned, we did a shorter episode on his podcast called "The Guy Doing Things," which will be linked below. And after that conversation, we just spoke a little bit about your vision for education. I think we have a very similar vision, and I do believe that education, not in the sense that we know it right now, but proper education. And with education, I mean giving people the tools to think for themselves and better themselves, but also the community they find themselves in, and even the country they find themselves in. I think that type of education can and will change the world. It's a great topic. So let's jump into today's one by just
awesome.
Could you just give me a definition of masculinity? What is masculinity to you?
It's weird having this conversation, first of all, again, about the same things, because we actually did this.
Yeah.
Hopefully this is, we just prayed that it works out. So, but I do love having it, and perhaps there might be some different conversational points coming out of this. But masculinity, as its most basic form, is the quality of the male sex. That's what I believe in. So, which obviously makes masculinity basically completely integral to being a man. Because if you're a man, you have masculinity, and obviously we know in today's world.
That's a very controversial statement in today's world, unfortunately.
Yes, and it can be, because of all the opinions we have about, all the sexes and whatever. This might be a place where someone might lose me. But going a bit more into a betterly, wow, that's not even a word.
Second language issues here, we get it.
A better defined way is what I found in Jack Donovan's book, The Way of Men. And he basically just divided into 4 tactical virtues, which he calls strength, courage, mastery, and honor. Ek weet nie of jy nou die deur gehoor het daar nie.
Ek het maar dis chill. Yeah.
Ek jammer. Okay. So he divides it into these 4 tactical virtues called strength, courage, mastery, and honor. And I think that's a perfect definition of masculinity. If you try to fit it to a man, it just, it just fits comfortably. It's like a jacket with the right cut. A man with strength, yes, that sounds good. A man with courage, yes, it sounds good. A man that has mastery in his art, yes, good. A man with honor, fantastic. So I think those virtues outlined by Jack Donovan in The Way of Men, is just, I think that's what I take to heart as my definition of masculinity.
Yeah, I love that. I love the virtues because I think if we get to the definition of toxic masculinity, it's probably those virtues being misguided or someone not having a mentor leading them into really mastering those virtues or using them for the good. So let's just get into that quickly. How would you define toxic masculinity then?
I completely agree with you there. To such an extent where these tactical virtues are being misused, or where they lead to harmful behavior, that is toxic masculinity. Okay, die deur gaan nou net weer toe gaan. Sorry, is baie aktiwiteit by my. Okay, so ek gaan net daar af aan. So at any point where a person misuses these virtues, which are good virtues in and of themselves, but when misused or mistreated, they can move into the toxic, let's call it arena or spectrum. I don't know what we're going to use today.
Because there's definitely different levels of toxic masculinity, I would say. Because you, like, the guy catcalling the girl and the guy raping the girl is not the same level of toxic.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a drastic example, but it's true. Because they always use these pyramids, and they're like, well, catcalling is where it starts.
Yes.
And I guess that's also kind of true. It's definitely a spectrum, and you can definitely grow into that, and it might start with smaller things.
Yeah.
And the more, like, you think that's okay, the more your aggression or behavior can go over to more toxic, obviously.
Yeah, I think in the, I don't know much about the contraband substance world, but what they call it is a gateway drug, and I think you get gateway behavior towards toxic masculinity, and I think that's where our vision for education and for, I think, basically the back end of this conversation is going to head to is what is the solution. I think if we intercept toxic masculinity at a very young stage, or at a very early stage, such things can be prevented.
Yeah, I totally agree. So when we talk about toxic masculinity, I really believe that no one is born, like no boy is born as a rapist or whatever, like anything that can be associated with toxic masculinity. I don't think people, like boys, are born like that. Definitely think it is society and certain circumstances that cultivates that behavior. Not saying that I think people should not take responsibility for their lives, because they totally should. And you can choose to be different no matter where you're born or what. Yeah. But the reality is that our environment, our culture, history, all these things definitely contribute to the way we see life and even the way we see masculinity. So from your perspective, bringing this back a little bit to the schools, and we can do both, because you obviously are teaching at a primary school that's not like a same-sex school, like it's a mixed school, but you were in a boys' school in high school, and I was in a girls' school in high school. So this is where the whole conversation originated, but through various conversations, we have shifted it a little bit. So But just to get back to the schools, what do you think? Um, what is it about our current school system? And that also completely links to culture, because at the end of the day, the culture will determine or have a big effect on the school. What are some of the main
Yeah.
things that you think are contributing to toxic masculinity in the South African context?
So yeah, it's a good question. Let's have a look at. So I'm going to answer it in two parts. I think the definition of masculinity we just mentioned can be cultured or not cultured from a young age, and I'm very thankful for the experience I have in a primary school now, because I'm actually a high school educator, and I've only taught high school up until now, and I've been in a primary school, but from since being in high school to actually teaching now at a primary school, I haven't been to a primary school since. So these virtues that I mentioned get lost very early, I think, because you get a misinterpretation of these virtues. If strength is a good virtue in and of itself, and no one can necessarily disagree with that, but strength that is misused or mislearned, and I'm saying learned because we just mentioned someone being born, and no one is born. I believe with you, I agree with you that no one is born a rapist, no one is born a
Sexist,
a evil person,
yeah.
I think, or a sexist or whatever. But these things can be conditioned or not conditioned, if it makes sense. So this is the first part of the answer. If something isn't conditioned, it won't be there. So the absence of something is also a big danger that can be seen further on in the road. I don't think toxic behavior is taught. It's non-toxic behavior is just not taught, and I think that's the biggest danger in schools. If you don't teach strength and basically leave it to be discovered, it can be a very, very dangerous playground. Mind the pun. A playground we are going to enter, because a little boy discovering that he can pick up a chair is brilliant, because he discovers how to use his hands, how to use his arms. But if he doesn't get taught that it's not good to throw the chair at someone or break it, then he doesn't necessarily have that filter in his mind or in his conditioning telling him this is not good. And obviously we can go from throwing a chair to all sorts of bad behavior down the line, so that's the first part. I think the absence of not teaching toxic masculinity or addressing it in the right manner is a big problem in schools that I see today. Secondly, the contribution of schools to toxic masculinity is what is being done about the signs of toxicness. Again, I don't know if that's a word, but about what is being done about toxic behavior. Now, the school system is flooded with a massive amounts of people, of kids, learners, and the disciplinary staff only have so much time to deal with issues, and if certain behaviors start to become apparent in a school system, you clearly see the disciplinary staff noticing it and sort of dealing with it, maybe calling a parent, which parents, we can head into another direction there with a conversation later on as well, and addressing it, and it goes past. But the issue is never really dealt with at a core level, at a deeper level than just reprimanding or giving a kid detention. And you know as well as me, in the schools where we were, 3 detentions for a high school boy is it's nothing. It's a few hours on a Friday or a Monday, and you deal with it, you get over with it, and you go on with life. It does not cater for really and truly solving small signs of masculinity. And those 2 that I just mentioned, the absence of learning correct values and the disciplining of incorrect values in a wrong way, those 2 can quickly and very dangerously get out of hand, and then it can very easily lead to a toxic culture.
Yeah, I just very much agree with what you're saying. I think even though I don't think we're born as like evil people, we are born into sin. If we think about obviously Genesis and what the Bible says about that, and I think it's very clear, and people need to understand that people are inherently evil. I had the opportunity to go to Finland in the beginning of the year, and the one thing that people found so strange was that I was, well, firstly, pretty cynical, because let's face it, I come from the most unequal society in the entire world, and they're like the most equal society in the world. So they're just like, trust the government, everything's great. And I'm like, your government still steals from you. It's just much less, but they still take your money. But cool. And they're just, so why are you so cynical? And I'm like, don't you know? People are evil. And people are like, no, they're not. I'm like, who do you think? Because the same people would be like, if there's a God, why would he allow people to die or like to be raped or something? I'm like, who do you think rapes people? People. It's not, God's not coming down raping people. It's people. Who do you think? Human trafficking is one of the biggest issues in the world right now. Every 30 seconds, a child gets stolen for sex trafficking, slavery, work slavery type of vibes, or organs. And it's not some angel stealing these children. It's people, because people are evil. And if we do not cultivate, like you said, these, so we have these characteristics, and if we do not mold them into what they were actually created to be, because I do believe that masculinity is a beautiful thing, and that God created it, and that it also allows females or women to be more feminine when men step into healthy masculinity. But the moment you let it just bloom on its own, it will take a evil form, a form that hurts people, because again, we're inherently evil.
Yeah.
And then also definitely with this disciplinary thing. Yes, that it's like, how do you pronounce this word?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I'm pretty passionate about this conversation is back in the day, my pre-Jesus life, I was a very strong liberal feminist, which I am not anymore. But
you're just strong now.
Yes, I'm just strong now.
No, I'm kidding.
No, I'm a strong woman. I'm for equal rights.
I'm
Everyone
kidding.
can chill, but I don't agree with this feminist movement right now, even though back in the day I did. And so we went to opposite schools, and I had a lot of issues with the guys in that school. Not all of them, but a specific group. And just because, and that's what, it's really funny. I just finished the last season of 13 Reasons Why. I don't recommend it. It was traumatizing, but I feel this commitment to the characters. So I was like, let me just suffer through this to see them end happily or something, because, wow. Not worth it.
I didn't even go there. I didn't even go.
Not
go there.
worth it.
I hear it's a great series, but
Yeah.
it's not my
You
cup
can
of
watch
tea.
the first
I'll
season,
stick to The Office.
but don't go further than the first one. But yeah, the first season when I watched that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is literally my high school experience. Like this is except I wasn't actually raped. I ran away. So thank you, Jesus, for that.
Yeah.
But I was in that situation so many
Yeah.
times, and I love it when people are like, oh yeah. I remember when the gender-based violence thing came up last year, and I had a conversation with my dad about it, and he was like, no, but like it's not our people, you know, like it's other people who do that. Like I went to a white Afrikaans school. I was almost raped 4 times, and all of them were white boys. Like this is not linked to a specific culture within South Africa. I would say it's actually unfortunately linked to the South African culture. Not that I believe all men are evil or anything like that, but there is this definite thing where there is no accountability for these type of actions. And obviously, I'm not trying to say that schools should take action when things happen outside of the school, or that schools should take responsibility for individuals. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that there is a space where these things are cultivated, and where there is a narrative that, in that sense, guys can do whatever they want, and like girls just kind of have to say yes, and if they're not saying yes, they actually meant yes. And there's somewhere they got this idea, and maybe it is at home, but it's not really necessarily contradicted at school. So it's still the main narrative. And I think it's really important to, like you said in your second answer, if we want to work on toxic masculinity, telling someone they should have, like, they have detention or something, that's not the issue. Like, we need to find out why. Yeah. Why do you behave this way? Because I think as much as we don't want to look at, like, especially, like, rapists, or I think it's a very difficult conversation to be like, oh, these people need help and not just punishment. But I do believe they need help. I do believe that if you are in that space, you have not learned how to master yourself, and something in you tells you that you will be worth more if you can overpower someone else, you know? Like, there's a deeper root issue. Not to say that, oh, people shouldn't go to prison or shouldn't take accountability. All those things should happen too. But if we actually want a better society, we cannot leave it at punishment. We need to figure out what do you actually need? What is the lie that you believe about yourself or about other people? Why do you believe women are worth less? I mean, you were birthed by one, so... Yeah.
Yeah, it gets complicated, this whole issue, and I think that's why I said conversation is the starting point for solving this whole dilemma, because I think we get lost in translation between Facebook posts. You know, if I put a black square as a photo, and I kind of go into the subject of Black Lives Matter, but I have no idea what it's about. I have no idea, about
how to effectively be
how systematic,
an anti-racist or anything like that.
Not necessarily that. I know how to not be a racist, but me putting a black square on without actually knowing or being informed about what systematic racism is and where it comes from and what the history of it looks like, I'm going to be I'm not going to help the movement. I'm actually going to be on the negative side of the movement. The same with feminism. And I'm touching on hard subjects now, so I'm probably going to get a few hate posts after this. But
welcome to my world.
People sharing stuff about feminism, and I have nothing against it, against feminism. But the people share posts where they make these outcries. But when you actually sit down and try to have a proper conversation with these people, they are so intolerable about your point of view. And it's the same with masculinity. And how are we going to solve that? How we are moving into a positive direction in masculinity and toxic masculinity will be through conversation. And I know that the points of view you have with regards to solving it and the points of view I have, we may have 20 solutions each, and maybe 10 will overlap. But then let's talk about those 10, because that's the way we'll solve this whole thing. Because we can't solve it with discipline. We saw that. And it's not being solved through education. We saw that. And the experiences, I'm really sorry. I, as a man and as a boy from that school, I would like to, publicly apologize to you on behalf of those guys, because it's a terrible experience. And I think to be in that situation, I can't imagine it, and I can't explain it. And it's not that I am trying to avoid talking about it or digging deeper into that topic, but the way in which I'm outraged at harmful and toxic masculinity is in a way that I want to solve it. I don't think necessarily dissecting it and pointing fingers will get us anywhere in the direction we need to, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I totally do. And I have so much respect for you for even being willing to have this conversation, because I also understand that men get really upset when there's a hashtag like men are trash or whatever, and then the backlash on not all men and stuff like that. And I think there's two perspectives on that, but like you said, I also really believe it's about conversation. And I mean, thank you for apologizing, even though I don't feel like you need to take responsibility just because you're the same gender as the people who did the same those things. But I do appreciate it, and I really love your heart for solving the issue. And
Thanks.
yeah, I just think that being willing to admit that there are people who are like me who behave in an abusive way is kind of the first step. Because if you actually, if we think about the broader issue of gender-based violence in South Africa, and why I'm obviously bringing this up because it's been in the news a lot, and you can't separate that from toxic masculinity. And also toxic femininity is also a thing, but that's just not the conversation we're having right now. And what I want to say about that is that a lot of times, even though I believe it's so worthy and good for us to have this conversation, a lot of times women can't actually change men's minds on the issue of toxic masculinity. I'm not even saying that men can do that to other men, but that there's a higher chance that if you're in the same position, there can be a change when there is conversation.
Yeah.
And even...
Yeah, it's not going to change from the other side, the other side around. The same with what I just mentioned with the black square. I have no idea. I had a conversation with someone the other day as well, and they also said, me posting a black square because I have a black friend, it's not going to help the issue, because I don't know the struggles. I don't know the inherent struggles with what with what comes with that. And the same with this conversation. Women should not be able to affect the way men think about that, because it's not their role. And I don't think it's a good thing for them to do that. Men should go out of their own and take care of their own kind. Men should stand up and say, listen, why should a woman or a girl tell you how to behave, you should know how to behave. And then through a process of leadership and mentorship, we need to be able to influence, men should be able to influence other men through this behavior. And that's something that I really, really hope to achieve, and what I'm trying to achieve in my quest through life.
Yeah. I don't think that women can't influence men in that area, but I do agree that it's not their responsibility, and it shouldn't have to be their responsibility. Of course, unfortunately, it seems right now that women, like, so there's this Instagram account, I think it's called, okay, I can't remember the name. So, Keep the Energy. That's the, and it shares about gender-based violence cases that have happened in South Africa, but it also shares practical ways on like how you can support your female friends, and what like ways where as a man you can address toxic masculinity in your circles. And it mentions things like when your friend catcalls a girl, like tell them, dude, this is not cool, like don't do that, you know. So it's not just this black square type of thing, you know. And they were looking at their statistics, and 80% of the people who follow them are women, because we care, because we're being murdered and we're being like raped, you know. Like, and it sounds like and it sounds bad saying that, but that's the reality, right? Like I think I spoke to my stepbrother the other day, and I was like, when I go out at night or just like walk on my own, I don't care being killed. Like that is so chilled with me. My issue is that that's generally not what happens. You get gang raped or something, and then they stab you, and then maybe you survive, and you're like, you have to deal with all this trauma. And I don't think the everyday guy necessarily does that, but statistically it happens like every 3 or 4 minutes. So that's a lot. So we care. But that's why I think this conversation is so good. And it's not because I necessarily want to just continue speaking about all the issues that are caused, but I do think if you actually have a conversation with someone who has been a victim or sharing their experience, you can understand. Of course, you won't necessarily completely understand because you might not have the same experience, but you can have a greater understanding of how important it is for women and how important it is for you as a man to properly love the woman around you by holding your friends accountable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes 100% sense, and I think it's a brilliant way of thinking about it. You just spoke about statistics, and you know, if it happens every 4 minutes, you know, it can't be the same 100,000 guys that do it. There has to be a bigger number, and what we need for that is something like a buddy system, and that's the tricky part of navigating this toxic part of the spectrum of masculinity, because I read an article in the New York Times called "Boys to Men: Teaching and Learning About Masculinity in an Age of Change," and the key questions they ask these young boys are, you know, what is a good man and what is a masculine man. So just the difference between the answers in those two questions shows us the disparity in the way we think about what it means to be masculine. And if we have a buddy system in place, something just like you mentioned, if we love the women around us enough to keep our friends around us accountable for the things they say and the things they do, that sort of buddy system should be able to expand throughout the world, and you know, become like a wildfire. That's the idealistic way of looking at it, but it will be awesome to have that sort of you know, system in place, and that's something that we should strive for more and with more earnest to push through with the things we think, the good things we think, to such an extent where we actually tell the people who are behaving in a way they shouldn't, to tell them in those circumstances, listen, this is not the right way to do it. If that becomes a culture, just imagine the world we can live in. This proper masculine culture, which is not a toxic masculine culture, but a masculine culture.
Yeah, I so agree, because the reality is, like, I just very much believe that one person can change the world, and this idea of like paying it forward, and how maybe for people a buddy system may seem like a small solution to a bigger issue, but I think simple solutions like that are really the way forward. And I would say I think it's more effective than some other bigger solutions. Because if you have one man who lives out his godly masculinity, I promise you it will inspire at least one other man. And that man will inspire someone else, and it will, like, by the end of the day, you have a whole nation who is inspired to live into their godly masculinity. But before we touch a little bit more on solutions, I want to kind of just bring up this idea of masculinity again. Besides just toxic masculinity when it comes to mastering other people and all that stuff, you said there's such a disparity between what people think a good man is and a masculine man is. And how do you think we can solve this idea of what is good masculinity? Or why do you think there is even this big thing where, for instance, certain things are still associated with manliness, like boys not crying, like showing your emotions well is not necessarily deemed as being a strong man, or very basic and old things, but in the majority of places, like doing sport is viewed as more masculine than, for instance, being in the theater company. Or to an extent, some of those things have definitely changed a little bit, but I think in a lot of spaces, especially because if we think about the Afrikaans culture, but also even just like African cultures, they're definitely a bit more traditional in that way, where certain things are still very much associated with masculinity, which I personally don't think needs to be. Like, I think all the values that you mentioned are so good, and like that is masculine, but that doesn't mean that you need to love rugby. Like that's not in the list. Like, that doesn't mean that you need to just get angry every time when you feel something because you don't know how to deal with it, or that you can't dress nice because that is, I don't know, apparently not masculine enough, or it's dumb things, but it definitely is still in the subconscious of a lot of people.
So what I think the issue is, and this is a part where we need to understand the history of how this took place. How manliness started taking on a negative connotation, just because watching rugby or supporting rugby is associated with manliness. The culture around it shaped the way we think about masculinity. So then, in a world where let's call it an ecosystem, we created an ecosystem where the strongest survived. Okay, and that's how it is in nature. The strongest of the species survive. At least that's what Darwin says. But we can talk about Darwin in another episode. And the attributes linked to the strongest, and I'm using parentheses now, was the ones that stood out, being able, having physical strength that stood out. And you see this William Wallace standing in front of everyone with a sword and yelling. You see that as masculine. But the guy at the back, who also fought, but he made the food for the warriors who came back, he was also masculine. I mean, he's in war. He makes food for the people. If they don't eat, nutritious food, they won't be able to go into battle. But just because he wasn't on the front line, or he wasn't on, on a horse with a sword, he's deemed as less masculine. And that's a culture. I mean, William Wallace, I'm not sure in what time that was, but from that culture already, you had that distinction between you're not as manly as we are because you weren't in the battle. You didn't share this experience with us. And that's what we see today. If you didn't see the game, you can't talk about it at lunch with the rest of the guys. And I think that's the issue where it comes in. The definition of a good man, and these were young kids answering these questions. To them, when you see a good man, or when you hear about a good man, the definition that comes up, it can include making food. You're a good man if you make food. You're a good man or if you can prepare dinner. If you're a good man if you smell nice, whatever. That's good. But a masculine man, then the kids started answering different stuff. And that is scary. Because masculinity, they started saying, okay, you need to be able to lift this thing, and you need to play rugby, and then they ask, well, if you're masculine, do you need to smell nice? And they're like, no, it's fine, you don't have to smell nice. And you see, there's where the disconnect comes in, is the culture that we have and the ecosystem that we have didn't necessarily praise those, let's call it soft skills. They're not necessarily soft skills. They are very important, because if I do not wear deodorant today, I can smell the difference between when I put on deodorant and not. And neither of the two situations, make me a better man or not, but it helps. Being smelling nice helps in the quest for masculinity. But in modern culture, those type of virtues aren't valued. And that's the issue, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Also, this...
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think also that like you said, for people it's more important to be seen as masculine than it is to be seen as good, or even, like you said, the fact that for a lot of people those two things are mutually exclusive, when in reality they're actually not. So
yes.
Kind of round up this conversation, do you have any practical tips for either individuals or suggestions for schools? Obviously, we're hoping that some rich person who wants to sponsor a great school who's that changes this nation is listening to this. So in case they're listening, do you have any practical things that you think we can do in our everyday lives, but even things that could be implemented in the school system that can change this narrative of masculinity, so that men can take their rightful place as as leaders and as world changers and as supporters, and just to love the women in their lives well instead of scaring them?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and it's I also hope someone with a financial aid is watching or is listening. No, I think first of all, we need to start with ourselves. So even whoever is listening now, if you are male, um, stop being afraid to share the good side of masculinity. And I almost said softer side, but it's not. Because being a good man doesn't make you be a soft man. And that's the danger. The things you see on social media with regards to masculinity can be scary. And I think if we start sharing physically, talking to people, and on social media, the healthy side of masculinity, we'll start seeing a massive change. And we need to start distinguishing. We need leaders to stand up. That's the second solution. We need leaders to stand up and say, listen, this is what masculinity is. Because the dangers these days of masculinity and where we draw the line, you're either a man or you're gay. And that's the most ridiculous way we can look at it.
And even if you're gay, I mean, that does not mean that you're not masculine. You know, like that's...
Yes, but so the homosexual conversation is also, we can have a bunch of episodes coming out of this one, so we can talk about. And I'm not I'm not saying anything rude to people who are gay, but the thing is that if we define masculinity on that sort of scale, it enters into this wormhole that we get today, because if you don't tick all 5 boxes of masculinity, you're immediately placed into another box, and it's not the way it's supposed to be. We need leaders to stand up and say, listen, this is what being a man is all about, and this is what masculinity looks like, and this is how we're going to promote it. And thirdly, in schools, this is something that I try to promote, and that we're actually doing at the moment with 3L. We are running a new leaders club. So although we're teaching leadership skills, the basic outflow of that is that mentorship will have a natural outflow to it, will be a natural product of it, and mentorship will allow us to step into that buddy system that I spoke about earlier. So not necessarily teaching masculinity, but teaching mentorship and leadership to kids to take a stand in terms of leadership and being mentors or being effective peers to their friends will help us. And this is for boys and girls. Leadership should be taught across the board, so that people understand, okay, this is how we take charge of situations, and this is how we conduct ourselves. At the very basic form, we need kids to understand their roles in societies. And I know that whole sentence might upset a few other people as well, because some people might ask, what is my role? Do I only have one role? What if that's not what I mean? I mean, there's a definite role that we play in society as men and as women, and they are so complementary and so beautifully created, these two roles, that if we can understand them both, we can move in such a beautiful direction where both sexes are complementary of each other. And the question you need to ask yourself, if you are part of the crowd that says, but what is my role? Why do I need to have a role like this? And what do you mean by role? It's just one question, and you can answer it at home. What kind of man would you rather have walking on earth? And that's a simple question, because you start to think, okay, do I want the one that's too afraid to stand up for himself on the scale? So we took away his toxic masculinity, and on top of that, his whole masculinity. So he's quiet and in the corner and shivering if he sees a ray of sunlight. Or would you rather have the man that understands his virtues, that stands by them and stands up for himself and his community and his society. Those are the two options, and those are the two the options
Yeah.
we have. If you ask yourself, what type of man would you like? Would you have on earth walking amongst you? What type?
I think, though, that, and obviously we don't have time to dig into this, but my perspective when it comes to masculinity and femininity is that, of course, God created us so differently, and that's beautiful, and we don't need to be the same because we're not, but we are the same in value, and God created both male and female in his image, but that we have for a very long time also limited what it means to be masculine. And just to kind of touch on something that you just said, you're like, oh, the guy like shivering and not being able to stand up. I think strength, you can stand up for something without being the guy leading everything, like I just think that we still have very clear pictures of to be a strong man means being the guy leading the crowd, but you can be a guy who is strong and you stand up for what you believe in, but in different ways, and you help your friends around you and you keep people accountable. Not to say, like, I totally get what you are trying to explain, and I'm not saying that I'm against what you're trying to say. I'm just saying that I think the picture is a bit broader, and even though I completely agree with the virtues, I think the application of these virtues can look very differently, still in a healthy way. And if we could move more on focusing on the virtues, like you said, having leaders who say, okay, as men, we are strong, we are this, and leaving them that broad without having all this extra of like, oh, men like beer and rugby and whatever, like, because a lot of those things are for some reason, I mean, I guess we kind of touched on it, but those things are still linked to strength. Why? It doesn't need to be. Like, the quarterback isn't the only strong one. Of course, you are also strong, but they're like a guy who's doing ballet. That guy is really strong. Like, can you do those things? I can't. But for some reason now we link that to weakness when it really just isn't. And so I completely agree that we have certain roles within society and that God has created us with certain goals. But I do think that spectrum of living out that goal is way broader than society or even the church always promotes. Because I think people are also scared when things are too different. Like, you can just see this within every society, every group. Like, people like boxes, and when you don't fit into it, it's so much easier to throw you out than it is to actually allow you to say, but teach me why do you believe it's this way? Or not to say that we're not allowed to say, oh, this is wrong, because of course we can, but to actually learn from other people and see like, oh, you are strong, but in a different way, and that's okay. And there doesn't need to constantly be this I'm better than you thing. But anyway, this has been a great conversation. I hope that the people listening to this have learned just as much as I have, and that you've enjoyed this conversation. So
it was
could
awesome.
you just quickly repeat your website and the places where people can find you? I will link everything in the description, but you can just name your podcast and all that fun stuff.
Okay, so the company, my company's name is 3L. So if you go on to Instagram, it will be at 3L, the number 3L, and then _brand. So we post, I think, cool content on there.
That's all that counts.
And then the website is 3lifestyle.co.za. So the 3 is spelled out, 3lifestyle.co.za, and the podcast is on there. So you can just click on the link podcast there, and the podcast is called The Guy Doing Things. And I do a bunch of challenges on there. I do a bunch of things just to try to expand my horizons and try to gain as much as I can out of life.
And to keep your podcast name relevant. I'm joking.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation and for your insight. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for having me. This was awesome.
That's it from me, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a second to rate this podcast, write a review, and share it with your friends. Have a beautiful day, and remember that you are so loved.